and other regional instruments. So, this is common sense stuff, but I think it's always good to remind ourselves of the common sense that we forget to think critically about. Why do police need codes of conduct? Because it's an upside-down organization. The people with the most power are the most junior. They are invisible to managers most of the time. It's low visibility. They're out on the streets. Huge discretionary power to make or break lives, to shape order or disorder. And they work in huge systems of laws and rights and treaties and all sorts of abstract things which most of us, even as supposed experts, are unfamiliar with, which most police are unfamiliar with. Police are not lawyers, police are not human rights scholars, and yet we send them out there and we expect them to do all these things, uphold laws, uphold rights. Codes of conduct provide cheat sheets to those normative frameworks. So there's all sorts of policy out there. We heard about all the standing orders and policies this morning. I'm sure you would agree that one can empathize with a frontline police officer who's expected to know the contents of those 25 standing orders and must be held accountable to them at all times. So codes provide simple language, cheat sheets, both through which members of the public who don't understand the law and the Constitution and rights can hold police accountable, and a way through which frontline officers can interpret their work. When linked to standards of behavior, the aspirational language that one finds in codes of conduct quite often can be measured and people can be held accountable. So when setting out and starting to write this paper, I was in touch with the SAPS, and the SAPS was kind enough to engage me and my questions around what we know about the drafting of the Code of Conduct in 1997. Sorry, it would have been drafted beforehand. It was launched in 1997. Some of you in the room might know more about this process and this period than I know, and more than those I was in touch with knew. There didn't seem to be much institutional knowledge, institutional memory about what kind of consultations might have taken place, who was steering things. What I did find was a master's thesis written by a police officer in the Western Cape, written in 1998, and he had managed to interview police managers and look at the internal communication that was coming through the organization in relation to this new code. And anyone who's interested, I would recommend you look it up at the Stellenbosch Library. They can send you the PDF. He noted that it was formulated with good intentions. It was about creating a new set of values for the newly established South African Police Service. It was drafted by a management committee, disseminated within the organization for comment, disseminated to police unions, and possibly to a few external stakeholders, but there's a lot of mystery in it. It was launched with lots of fanfare, codes of conduct being dropped from the sky, big ceremonies where everybody was signing the code together. All of that stuff is rich and symbolic, and policing is all about symbolism. So I think it all sounds positive. It was linked to lots of talk of professionalism. I'll talk about what we find in parliamentary minutes shortly. But the same language that we've seen post-National Development Plan about we need to professionalize the police, we need this code of conduct to hold them accountable, was right there in the late 90s, at the time that this code was released. It was disseminated in an ad hoc manner. As with so many things, managers were saying, we've got this new standing order, we've got this new code of conduct, tell your members about it, and that commanders, tell your members about it, and so forth and so forth. So it seemed it was kind of pushed out there in a way that the SAPS was saying, we need to distance ourselves from the past, we've got this new code of conduct, let's make sure we can report to South Africa that everybody has signed, that they have received the code and they are familiar with it. I looked through parliamentary monitoring group minutes of the Portfolio Committee of Safety and Security at the time, now police. And as I say, it's eerily familiar. Firstly, in 1998, a year after the code was launched, we see SAPS managers telling the portfolio committee that we are busy formulating a code of conduct. So that's contradictory. It was launched a year earlier, but it was still being formulated. Promises were being made about how this thing is going to hold people accountable. If you look through the other comments in the policy brief, you'll see similar things. Then between 2000 and 2008, there's no mention of a code of conduct in a portfolio committee meeting. In 2012, the NDP is published. The NDP says we want the SAPS to change, we have a new vision, and one of the ways we're going to bring this vision about is through the code of conduct. So from 2012 to 2016, we've seen lots of reference to the code of conduct, professionalism, code of conduct being used to bring about professionalism. This might sound laborious, but I'm just showing that there's a cycle here. The NDP seems new, but in a way, it's the echo of the new SAPS in the mid-90s, similar conversations. So what did the NDP say? What does it say in terms of fixing the South African Police Service? I'm going to focus on the code of conduct. It does talk about a code of ethics, a code of conduct, and there's a slightly different phrasing, professional standards, or yeah, there's something slightly different. I'm focusing specifically on the code of conduct here. The NDP says we need to build professional police officers. To do that, we need to be able to set standards and hold them individually accountable when they don't meet those standards. Those standards should be easily identifiable in the code of conduct. Non-adherence should mean you don't get promotions, you don't get rewarded, and when you do perform in line with the code of conduct, your career moves along. The NDP said the code of conduct needs to be incorporated into the disciplinary regulations. I'll talk about those later. We did see the SAPS release new regulations in November, but it's not clear how they relate to the NDP's requests. The NDP calls for periodic checks to see that members understand what the code is and are able to demonstrate that they are using it to guide their work. I think this is very difficult to do. Disciplinary cases involving a breach of the code should be dealt with as a priority. I think this is a little bit naive on the part of the NDP because any disciplinary case is a breach of the code. There is a category breach of the code of conduct, but everything else is similarly a breach. So how should the SAPS interpret that? The NDP also said members charged with a breach of the code must leave their station immediately. Again, this isn't very practical. Firstly, in terms of labor law, I'm not a lawyer, but I think it's clear that if I have a grudge against Advocate Bokoli and I accuse him of something, that doesn't mean he needs to be immediately suspended. Maybe if there's a prima facie case, but that's not what the NDP talks about. Professionalism should be attained through enforcing the code of conduct. That's the NDP. Again, that's exactly what we see in the late 90s. In brief, there are a whole lot of other points which I removed when I realized my presentation was far longer than I was going to have time for. But basically, the NDP is saying the SAPS must develop indicators through which behavior can be evaluated with clear disciplinary and career consequences. If you commit this offense, then this is going to be the outcome, and that needs to be standardized, as one would see in case law, perhaps. But again, labor law is not criminal law, and I'm not sure it's as easy as the NDP has made it out to be. Looking a little bit at how the SAPS has responded to the NDP's recommendations. Firstly, it isn't clear. There's lots of rhetoric from all over the government that we are doing X and Y because this is what the NDP has said for us. There is more reference to there has been an increase in reference to the code of conduct throughout SAPS annual reports in the years since the NDP was published. So for instance, I've just circled the bottom here, that all of those references, those are the only references in that annual report, and they're all on one page. Whereas the most recent annual report, you find them spattered throughout the report, showing that there's this idea that we're trying to incorporate the code of conduct into everything we do. The SAPS does acknowledge, as we saw this morning with the long list of standing orders, it acknowledges that inadequate command and control, ill discipline is leading to lack of professionalism, and that the organization isn't living the code of conduct, it hasn't internalized it. So this is a statement that, yes, we, the SAPS, agree with the NDP's critique. And yet, if you look at the SAPS performance measurement indicators, they make no reference to the code of conduct. they look at disciplinary figures, but the NDP is saying you need to be able to hold people accountable using indicators that show a breach of the code of conduct. The SAPS doesn't have any indicators. We talked a bit about this morning in terms of if we're going to monitor, if we want to see change in the SAPS through changes in monitoring, we need to think about the indicators that we use to measure them by. So codes of conduct are aspirational. They're often pretty unrealistic if you look at them, which is something we could talk about, but we may not have time to. But because they are aspirational, they rely on other systems to support their enforcement. In the case of the SAPS, these are the disciplinary regulations for the most part. As I mentioned earlier, the regulations are meant to ensure continuity in disciplinary procedures so that I, as a new recruit, know exactly what happens if I do these things. These are the things that will happen to me. This is a fair disciplinary system. It respects my rights. I will respect the organization. However, the disciplinary regulations also give disciplining officers huge discretion in interpreting the seriousness of an offense. So, again, this is probably necessary for labor law. But if I, as a police officer, disrespect somebody in a rural town, disrespect a victim of crime in a rural town, that offense may be interpreted very differently by a disciplinary officer than it would in a busy city station where things that are considered far more serious are taking place. So I don't think, once again, I think the NDP may have simplified things and or possibly even been a little naive in its call for everything to be standard and regular. The new SAPS regulations that came out on the 1st of November add a whole lot of new offences, but they don't seem to relate to the NDP's calls in relation to the code of conduct. This may not be because the SAPS is ignoring the NDP. I can see how the SAPS might say, well, we have everything that the NDP is asking for. Again, going back to the many policies we heard about this morning, it is easy to say, well, we're going to tick all these boxes. We don't need to change. We've got things. But if that's the case, if that's what the SAPS thinks, then I think there does need to be a public conversation about that so that those of us interested in the NDP's recommendations can understand how the SAPS is interpreting them. Codes of conduct are linked to misconduct, but they're obviously also about professionalism and all the good stuff. The way that it is being measured in the SAPS is through discipline. If we look at the disciplinary data, misconduct data, 60% of cases are made up of the following offences: common law and statutory offences, which maybe Donald Trump was in my head and I thought those are the bad hombres, because you don't want cops committing criminal offences. That 30 to 40% of disciplinary hearings are relate to breaking the law. The others failing to comply with a contravention or an act, failure to carry out a lawful order, being absent from work. Those are all internal things. Those are managers saying, these people, these members aren't listening to me, I need to bring some discipline to the unit. Only 2% of disciplinary cases, misconduct cases, are categorized contravened any prescribed code of conduct for the SAPS or public service. Again, I think this category needs to be interrogated because any offence is a breach of the code. If any offence is a breach of the code, how does this relate to the NDP's vision of a better police organisation brought about through the code? Just a quick glance at the outcomes of the disciplinary hearing. So we've got those 60% of cases made up of those various categories. We've also got most outcomes falling into 4 categories. Around 8 to 10% of people are dismissed. 12% have dismissals suspended, which seems to me bizarre. I'm not sure if anyone with the labour law can explain that, but you've committed an offence for which you should be dismissed, but we're not going to dismiss you, and this will only hang over you for 6 months. Case withdrawn, about 15%, and 20 to 30% found not guilty. So we've got lots of cases coming through, but almost 50% of people are, sorry, not almost 50%, at least 30% in some years are simply being dismissed. and case withdrawn, honest case withdrawn, 15% case withdrawn. So around 45% not guilty and case withdrawn, which doesn't mean people aren't guilty, it just means disciplinary procedures in an organization like a police, in a police organization can be very difficult. If we look at the disciplinary cases over the last 5 years, we see a decline in the resolution of them. Fewer people are being subjected to disciplinary cases, which isn't necessarily good or bad, but the SAPS has set targets by which it wants to measure its ability to close these cases timelessly, and it's missing these targets. So 1,566 in 2011-2012, down to 1,224 cases last year. 10% not resolved in 2011-2012, 27% not resolved last year. There seems to be a slipping in the disciplinary system. Now what I did with the guidance of Sean and Akhoff in the policy brief was to look at the African Union's guidance on codes of conduct for police organizations on the continent, as well as the South African Regional Police Chiefs Code of Conduct and related indicators that were put together by Sean and Amanda. This is just a snapshot of some of the things the African Union recommends an organization and government do when formulating a code of conduct, and I think we need to think of these in relation to the very little we know about what happened in the 90s. So, increased participation of civil society in developing the code of conduct. There isn't any indication that civil society was involved in the development of the code, the SAPS code, though some of you might remember this, I might be wrong. As I say, there were very few breadcrumbs in the forest when I was trying to figure out what went on back then. Involve stakeholders from all interested groups. That could be any citizen. Again, there was reference to some academics being consulted, but otherwise it seemed to be internal or union related. And then promote compliance with the code through ongoing monitoring and evaluation. There doesn't seem to be, I'm not sure whether there has been an attempt by the SAPS at any point in the last 20 years to monitor and evaluate adherence to the code of conduct other than through disciplinary data. Disciplinary data is weak for many reasons. Operationally, budget and plan for comprehensive consultation, provide the legal literacy for learning opportunities to participants in the development of the code, etc., etc. Undertake regular review of the code. It doesn't seem that the SAPS has reviewed it, but what has happened over the years is the code of ethics has been introduced and the SAPS values have been introduced. Again, the NDP is a little unclear on this. It doesn't distinguish the SAPS values, the code of ethics and the code of conduct. Where if I were the SAPS and I were being told, you're not adhering to your code of conduct, I would say, but I've got these values, and these values are very clear. Which goes back to say, things are complicated. Looking at the SAHRC code of conduct, I didn't ask you to stop and ponder the SAPS code at the beginning, which I should have, because the SAPS code says, I commit myself to addressing all causes of crime, to investigating anything that endangers the community. Very big statements that no individual can do by themselves. Is that good? Is that unrealistic? If I as a cop see this and I say, well, this is unrealistic, so of course I can't be held accountable to this. Or is it good enough by saying, this is what we as an organization are aspiring to, and we need to have these things in our mind. The SAHRC code, I think, is very different. It's very clear. It's very simple. For instance, respect for human rights, rather than what do we have here? Rather than I commit myself to creating a safe and secure environment for all people in South Africa by participating in endeavors aimed at addressing the cause of crime. That's very long-winded. Respect for human rights, non-discrimination, use of force, torture, cruel and inhumane degrading treatment. They're catchy articles that can stick in the practitioner's mind, and if I want to measure myself, or if my manager wants to measure whether I'm adhering to these articles, we can say, in the performance of their duties, police officials shall respect and protect human dignity and maintain and uphold the human rights of all persons. Perhaps still a little aspirational, but much clearer than what one sees in SAPS Code of Conduct. Okay, some of the things that are in the SAHRC code which are missing from the SAPS code, even though SAPS is a signatory to SAHRC code. The SAPS code has no clear statement on the use of force. We talked earlier about whether the SAPS captures and monitors use of force incidents. No clear statement on torture in the SAPS code, no clear statement on treatment of detainees, no clear statement on treatment of victims, limited statement on the rule of law, limited statement on trust, no clear statement on confidentiality, property rights. So, back to monitoring and evaluation, and we are nearing the end. The NDP wants the code of conduct to be measurable. I don't think it's necessarily easy, but it's not impossible either. I do think that it would be worth us, it would be worth the SAPS, it would be worth interested stakeholders thinking this through. I mentioned that Sean and Amanda had gone through an exercise linked to the SAHRC code. This isn't the SAHRC code. This is my attempt to replicate their methodology with the SAPS code. But just as an example of an exercise that we and the SAPS might think through. So if the first line of the SAPS code is, I commit myself to creating a safe and secure environment for all people by participating in endeavors aimed at addressing the cause of crime, what would be the indicator? Firstly, because that is an unreasonable thing, a SAPS officer isn't going to address the causes of crime. They're not going to give wholesome food to the baby growing in the womb of the malnourished mother, for instance, which is going to influence criminality later in life, potentially, at a societal level. So, one way to think about it would be the police official works to solve or refers to the relevant authority matters that come to his or her attention that may contribute to crime or disorder. How would we measure this? The police official is familiar or unfamiliar with the government departments and other stakeholders with whom they can cooperate, etc. I don't think this is necessarily super helpful, but I think it isn't super helpful in part because there is an abstractness to the SAPS code of conduct. The SAHRC code offers some very clear examples which I think would be useful for the SAPS to reflect on. Just in closing, I think, a very simple way to make a code of conduct actionable is the following, which the New Zealand Police Service offers to its members. And I think an operational police officer could ask these questions of themselves, a manager could ask them of the officer, and a member of the public could ask them of the officer. If in doubt, consider these questions. Scrutiny: would my decision or behavior withstand scrutiny and be seen as appropriate by others? Very simple. Ensure compliance: does my decision or behavior comply with the code and other police policy, general instructions, and procedural expectations? Very simple, often not. Lawful: is your decision lawful and fair? Is your decision or behavior fair and reasonable? The reason I think this is so powerful is that the code is abstract, it is long, it is difficult to remember. And it in itself is meant to be a cheat sheet to this much bigger normative framework of laws and rights and treaties, which I don't think we are going to remember the content of, and I don't think the average cop is going to remember the content of. So we need to figure out how to shrink things down so that they're usable and actionable and understandable to all of us. In summary, the SAPS code was possibly formulated in a hurry, so it's not clear. There's little institutional or documentary record. The language at the time was very similar to that of post-2010 and post-2012. I say post-2010 because there was an emergence of the professionalism rhetoric in the police field in 2010, but I think it accelerated a lot after the NDP came out. I think it informed the NDP and it's been adopted by everyone since then. So we're going around in circles in a little bit. The NDP calls for the code to be linked to clear consequences. It's unclear whether that's happened. We've got new disciplinary regulations, but it's unclear how they relate to the code of conduct. Lots of disciplinary data is available, but it's not unproblematic. It's unclear how they link, and there's plenty of learning that everybody could do. I asked this question earlier, is the NDP naive? I'm not trying to diss the NDP. I think it's an amazing document, it provides a good vision, but we don't want to be chasing unrealistic goals. That's not going to help the SAPS. It's not going to help accountability institutions. So I think we might need to revisit what the NDP says, what exactly does it want in relation to this code of conduct, and how that's going to shape the police, and then how do we develop the monitoring and evaluation indicators for that vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So we'll save the questions until the panel has presented, and I'd like to hand over to Advocate Nicole.
Thanks, good morning, everyone.